Charlotte, North Carolina, 2012. The evening air hung thick and warm, the remnants of a humid southern summer pressing against the walls of the Moore household. The quiet hum of the ceiling fan in the kitchen provided the only sound, aside from the occasional distant chirping of cicadas outside the window. The house was still, a rare moment of peace in a home usually filled with the laughter and footsteps of children. Angelica Moore moved about the kitchen, rinsing dishes under the steady stream of warm water. The smell of the evening's meal lingered: roast chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, green beans, a dinner prepared with care, as she always did. The scent of lemon-scented dish soap clung to her hands as she scrubbed, the rhythmic motion a familiar comfort. Her husband, Julian, had excused himself from the table early, retreating into the living room, his phone in hand, while their children, Marcus and Camille, had already disappeared into their rooms. She sighed, wiping her damp hands on a kitchen towel before gathering the stray glasses and placing them in the dishwasher. The day had been long, her shift at the hospital draining her more than usual, but she didn't mind. She had built a life she was proud of, a loving husband, 2 beautiful children, a home filled with warmth and stability. Everything she had worked for, sacrificed for, was here within these walls. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Julian's phone resting on the counter near the fruit bowl. The screen remained dark, but she remembered he had been expecting an important work call that evening. He had specifically mentioned it over dinner, saying he needed to stay reachable. Normally, she would have ignored it, but something made her pause. Perhaps it was instinct. A quiet, nagging sense of unease that had been growing over the past few months. The late nights at work. The hushed conversations that ended abruptly when she walked into the room. The way Julian seemed distant, absent, even when he was physically present. She had pushed those thoughts away, convinced herself she was imagining things. After all, they had been together for 12 years. He was the man she had trusted with her heart, the father of her children. She reached for the phone, intending only to glance at the screen in case the work call had come through. The moment her fingers brushed against it, the screen illuminated. A single notification flashed at her. A message. 3 simple words. I love you. She stared at the screen, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. A slow, creeping cold spread through her chest, an invisible hand tightening around her ribs. Her pulse thudded loudly in her ears, drowning out the quiet sounds of the house around her. It had to be a mistake. A misunderstanding. A wrong number. Then she saw the sender's name. Lauren. Her stomach dropped. A hollow ache formed in the pit of her stomach, a sensation both foreign and deeply, horrifyingly familiar. She swiped at the screen with trembling fingers, opening the full conversation. A series of messages unraveled before her, each one a blade slicing through her with merciless precision. Last night was incredible. I miss you. Can't wait to see you again. Time seemed to slow, the words stretching out before her like a sickening taunt. She could barely breathe. Her sister. The girl she had raised, protected, nurtured. The girl who had shared her home, her childhood, her life. And her husband. The man she had loved unconditionally. The man she had believed in, built a future with. They had betrayed her. The phone trembled in her grasp as she scrolled further. Hotel reservations. Late-night calls. Plans for stolen weekends. It was all there. Undeniable. A marriage built on 12 years of love and trust, unraveled in a matter of seconds. She felt as though she had been plunged into freezing water, her breath stolen from her lungs, her body numb. Julian's voice drifted from the living room, casual, carefree, as though nothing had changed. As though the walls of their home weren't closing in around her, suffocating her under the weight of a truth she was never meant to find. She swallowed hard, the metallic taste of betrayal thick on her tongue. She could have confronted him then and there. She could have stormed into the living room, thrown the phone at him, demanded answers. She could have screamed, cried, let the rage consume her in that moment. But she didn't. Instead, she set the phone back on the counter, precisely as it had been, ensuring nothing appeared disturbed. She turned off the kitchen faucet, wiped down the counters with slow, deliberate movements, her mind blank even as her hands worked on autopilot. Then she walked to the bathroom, locked the door behind her, and stared at her reflection in the mirror. She barely recognized the woman looking back at her. Her dark brown eyes, once full of warmth, were wide, hollow, unblinking. Her smooth skin, always radiant with quiet confidence, seemed paler, stretched thin over the sharp angles of her face. The soft curls that framed her features suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. For the first time in her life, she felt truly alone. Her breathing slowed, her chest rising and falling in controlled, measured movements. She had to think. The pain was suffocating, a raw wound she couldn't yet touch. But beneath it, something else stirred. Something dark. Something cold. A part of her that she had never met before. She turned away from the mirror, walked out of the bathroom, and re-entered the kitchen. The house was still quiet, untouched, the illusion of normalcy hanging in the air like a cruel joke. She glanced at Julian's phone once more. Then, with a final steadying breath, she reached for a wine glass, poured herself a drink, and sat down at the dining table. She would not confront him. Not yet. She would wait. Because now, the game had changed. Angelica did not scream. She did not storm into the living room and throw Julian's phone at him. She did not march upstairs to confront Lauren, demanding explanations that would only be laced with lies. Instead, she pressed the phone back onto the counter with deliberate precision, ensuring it lay exactly as he had left it. She took a slow, steady breath and forced her trembling hands to still. The kitchen smelled of warm spices and citrus-scented cleaning products, a homey contrast to the cold detachment settling over her. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, but outwardly, she was composed. She had spent years learning patience, mastering the delicate balance between chaos and control. In the hospital, where she worked as a nurse, she had seen people at their most vulnerable, panicked, desperate, clawing for any semblance of stability. It was her job to stay calm, to be the steady presence in a storm. Now, she turned that same discipline inward. She could not afford to break. Instead, she would watch. That night, she moved through her routine as if nothing had changed. She kissed the children goodnight, tucked them into bed, and read Camille her favorite bedtime story. Julian entered the room just as she was closing the book, ruffling Marcus's hair before turning to his wife with a familiar, affectionate smile. His eyes held nothing but ease, as though the world had not shifted beneath her feet just hours before. Angelica returned the smile. She let him press a kiss to her forehead, inhaling the scent of his aftershave, woodsy, familiar, suddenly foreign. Then she slipped into their shared bedroom, changed into her nightgown, and lay beside him in their bed, her body perfectly still as his breathing deepened into sleep. She stared at the ceiling for hours, her mind working through every interaction, every detail she had overlooked. She had to be sure. In the days that followed, Angelica sharpened her senses like a blade. She no longer viewed Julian and Lauren through the eyes of a wife or a sister. Instead, she became an observer, detaching herself from emotion and analyzing every interaction with a newfound clarity. Lauren came over frequently, as she always had. But now, Angelica noticed things she had been blind to before, the way Julian's eyes lingered on her sister just a second too long, the way Lauren's smile curved at the corners when she spoke to him. It was subtle, nearly imperceptible, but now that Angelica knew what to look for, it was undeniable. Lauren moved through the house with an ease that no longer felt like the comfort of family, but rather, the confidence of someone who belonged in spaces she should not. She leaned against the kitchen counter in the mornings, sipping coffee, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her cup while Julian joked with her in low tones. They thought they were careful. They thought she was oblivious. Angelica continued to play her role flawlessly. She laughed at Julian's stories at the dinner table, nodded in agreement when Lauren talked about work, and maintained the careful balance of warmth and indifference that had defined her relationship with both of them for years. But beneath the surface, she took note of everything. The way Julian's phone vibrated at odd hours, and how he would glance at it, then slip it into his pocket without answering. The way Lauren's voice softened just slightly when she said his name. The way Julian's hand would graze the small of Lauren's back in passing, a touch so brief it could be mistaken for nothing, except now, Angelica knew better. She checked Julian's schedule, memorizing his excuses for late nights. He worked hard, of that, she had never doubted, but now she saw the gaps, the inconsistencies, the unaccounted for hours. She checked Lauren's, too. She noticed when her sister left work early. When she canceled plans. When she mentioned places Angelica had never heard of, places Julian had also conveniently referenced in passing. Patterns formed. She did not confront them. Not yet. Instead, she planned. She adjusted her own schedule, ensuring her presence, or lack thereof, was predictable. She planted small seeds of doubt among friends and neighbors, casually mentioning that Julian had seemed distant lately, or that Lauren had been spending more time away from home. She began to withdraw, just slightly. Not enough to raise suspicion, but enough to make them comfortable. She wanted them to believe they were safe. She needed them to let their guard down. At night, she lay beside Julian, her body motionless as he slept soundly beside her. She listened to the steady rise and fall of his breath, feeling the weight of his betrayal press against her chest like an unbearable force. She envisioned what would come next. The pieces were already moving into place. She only had to wait. Angelica had planned every detail with precision. There was no room for error, no space for hesitation. The weeks leading up to this night had been filled with careful calculations, quiet observations, and a patience she never knew she possessed. Every move was deliberate, every step designed to ensure that when the moment came, there would be no escape. She had studied Julian's habits with the meticulousness of a scientist conducting an experiment. She noted the nights he claimed to be working late, the weekends when he mysteriously had errands to run, the hours when Lauren's car was parked a few streets away from their house instead of at her apartment. She had memorized his lies, traced the patterns of his deception until they were as familiar to her as his breathing beside her in bed. She had also been careful to construct the necessary illusion. In conversations with her colleagues, she spoke of Julian's growing distance, of the tension creeping into their marriage. She let friends see a woman struggling with a husband who was no longer the man she had married, planting the seeds of a story that would later serve as her alibi. Then, she waited. She didn't act on impulse. She didn't lash out in rage. She let the anger simmer, let it harden into something cold and unbreakable. She knew that revenge wasn't about passion, it was about control. The opportunity presented itself naturally, almost as if fate had laid the perfect path before her. Julian mentioned, in his usual offhand way, that he would be staying home that Friday night to catch up on work. It was a lie, of course. She had checked his phone earlier that day. A message from Lauren, short but unmistakable, "See you at 10. Angelica made arrangements for the children to spend the weekend at their grandmother's house. She kissed them goodbye, held them close for a moment longer than usual, inhaling their scent, memorizing the warmth of their small arms around her neck. Then she began to prepare. She dressed carefully, choosing a gown that draped elegantly over her figure, the deep red fabric cascading over her skin like liquid. She lit candles in the dining room, let their glow cast flickering shadows along the walls. She set the table, each plate and glass positioned with deliberate precision. She cooked his favorite meal, letting the rich scent of roasted lamb and garlic fill the house. Finally, she opened a bottle of his favorite whiskey, pouring 2 glasses. In one of them, she carefully dissolved the powerful sleeping pills she had acquired weeks before. She watched the liquid swirl, the bitterness masked beneath the amber warmth. By the time Julian walked through the front door, the house looked like the perfect portrait of a loving home. He hesitated in the doorway for the briefest moment, perhaps sensing something was different, something just slightly out of place. But then he smiled. The same easy, practiced smile he had given her 1,000 times before. The same smile that had once reassured her, once made her feel safe. He didn't know. He had no idea. She greeted him as she always did, her voice smooth, her touch gentle. She led him to the dining table, poured him the whiskey, watched as he took the first sip without a second thought. She listened as he spoke, nodding at the appropriate moments, letting him believe that nothing had changed. But everything had changed. He drank deeply, the tension of the day melting from his shoulders. He complimented the meal, the ambience, the effort she had put into the evening. He looked at her with something almost like affection, as if he had already convinced himself that he was still the devoted husband, still the man who deserved this life. She let him believe it. She let him talk. She let him drink. And then, slowly, his words began to slur. His eyelids drooped. He frowned, confusion flickering across his face as he tried to focus on her, his body betraying him as the drug took hold. His head swayed slightly. His fingers twitched against the tablecloth. He opened his mouth, as if to ask a question, but the words never formed. His breath came slower now, his body heavy with exhaustion. She rose from her chair and walked around the table, standing behind him as he struggled to keep his eyes open. She leaned down, her lips close to his ear. She whispered something, words he wouldn't remember. Then she watched as his head lolled to the side, his breathing deep and steady, his body slumped against the chair. The room was silent except for the soft crackle of the candles, the distant hum of the refrigerator, and the sound of her own heartbeat, steady, unshaken, prepared. She checked the time. Lauren would arrive soon. Everything was in place. The night had only just begun. Julian's breath was slow and rhythmic, his body completely limp in the chair. The whiskey glass was still clutched loosely in his hand, tilted just slightly, a single drop clinging to the rim before falling soundlessly onto the polished wood of the dining table. The candlelight flickered, casting elongated shadows along the walls, painting the room in a golden glow that belied the darkness settling inside her. Angelica stood over him, her gaze steady, her heartbeat even. He looked so peaceful, so unaware. She tilted her head slightly, studying the man she had once loved, the man she had trusted above all others. His chest rose and fell, steady, vulnerable. With slow, practiced movements, she reached into the pocket of his jacket, retrieving his phone. Her fingers moved with precision as she unlocked it, scrolling through the familiar list of messages until she found Lauren's name. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for only a second before she typed. "Come over. The door will be open." She sent the message and placed the phone back in his jacket, exactly as she had found it. She adjusted the candle on the table, straightened the napkin beside his plate, and then walked to the living room. She sat in the armchair, her posture relaxed, her hands resting on her lap. And she waited. The night stretched around her, wrapping the house in silence. The occasional creak of the wooden floorboards, the faint sound of a car passing outside, the distant bark of a dog, all of it felt distant, inconsequential. The world was still moving, unaware of what was about to unfold behind these walls. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. A car engine rumbled outside, then shut off. Footsteps approached, quick but careful, pausing just beyond the front door. The handle turned. Lauren stepped inside. She moved cautiously, her eyes adjusting to the dim candlelight, her head tilting slightly as she scanned the space. The scent of whiskey and roasted meat still lingered in the air, but the atmosphere had shifted. Angelica remained seated, watching. Lauren hesitated, then took a step forward, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She glanced toward the dining table, her gaze settling on Julian's slumped form. Confusion flickered across her face, a moment of hesitation as she tried to piece together what she was seeing. Angelica didn't speak. Lauren walked further inside, her footsteps slow, unsure. She was close now, just feet away from the threshold of the bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, inviting, waiting. Angelica finally moved. She stood, her motions fluid, her presence deliberate. She walked toward Lauren, her movements silent. Lauren turned at the last second, just as Angelica reached her. Their eyes met. There was a single beat of stillness, a breathless, frozen moment where everything stood suspended in time. Lauren's expression shifted from confusion to realization, a sharp intake of breath parting her lips. Angelica didn't give her time to react. She shoved her forward, into the bedroom, the door swinging open wider as Lauren stumbled inside. The dim glow from the bedside lamp illuminated Julian's unconscious form sprawled across the mattress. His face was slack, peaceful, oblivious. Lauren barely had time to turn before Angelica was behind her, pushing the door shut with a quiet, deliberate click. A sharp gasp broke the silence. Then, nothing. The first cut was precise. Blood bloomed instantly, spreading in a dark, widening stain across the pristine white sheets. A wet gurgle filled the room, followed by the desperate shuffle of feet against the hardwood floor. Another cut. A choked sob. A broken gasp. The scent of iron thickened in the air, mingling with the fading aroma of candle wax and whiskey. Lauren's body crumpled, her hands clutching at the wound, dark red seeping between her fingers. She slumped forward, her knees hitting the floor with a dull thud. Julian stirred, but barely. His body was too heavy, too sluggish to respond. He wouldn't wake, not yet. Angelica stepped back, her breath slow and measured. The room was silent again. Only the distant ticking of the clock in the hallway remained, steady, indifferent. The blood spread, soaking into the sheets, dripping onto the floor, tracing the outline of their betrayal in deep crimson. Angelica turned, her pulse steady. She walked back through the door, down the hall, into the kitchen. The faucet turned on with a soft hiss, warm water rushing over her hands, swirling pink as it washed away the evidence of what she had done. She dried them methodically, reaching for the linen towel hanging beside the sink. Her movements were slow, deliberate, detached. She poured herself a glass of water, the cool liquid sliding down her throat, washing away the dryness. There was no satisfaction. No rush of relief. Only silence. Only emptiness. The flashing red and blue lights painted the darkened streets in rhythmic pulses, illuminating the quiet neighborhood in bursts of harsh color. The sound of sirens had long since died down, replaced by the muffled voices of officers moving methodically through the house. The scent of blood, thick and metallic, lingered in the air, mingling with the fading aroma of candle wax and whiskey. Angelica sat in the living room, motionless, her hands resting in her lap. Her gaze was fixed on a point in the distance, unseeing, her expression eerily calm. The chaos unfolded around her, the hurried footsteps, the crackling voices on police radios, the hushed murmurs of neighbors gathering just beyond the doorway. The first officer to enter the house hesitated. He had responded to many calls before, domestic disputes, break-ins, occasional violence, but there was something different about this scene. The stillness. The quiet. The way the woman before him did not flinch, did not react, did not move. His partner entered behind him, stepping carefully over the threshold. They exchanged a brief glance before advancing. It was over. The bedroom told the story in stark, undeniable detail. The white sheets, now soaked in deep crimson. The bodies, motionless. The still warm air heavy with the unmistakable scent of death. The knife, lying abandoned on the floor, its blade reflecting the dim light of the bedside lamp. They found Julian first, his breathing shallow, his body slack. The drugs in his system still held him in a state of near unconsciousness, sparing him, for now, from the full horror of the night. The wounds were deep but not fatal, painful, permanent, but survivable. Lauren had not been so lucky. The officers didn't speak as they assessed the scene. There was nothing to say. The evidence lay before them, raw and undeniable. One of them turned back toward the living room, approaching Angelica with measured steps. She did not resist when they pulled her hands behind her back, the cold metal of the handcuffs snapping into place. She did not flinch when they read her rights in a detached, professional tone. She did not ask questions. She had nothing left to say. ####. The news spread quickly. By morning, the headlines were already splashed across every local paper. A woman scorned. A night of vengeance. Betrayal and bloodshed in the heart of Charlotte. The media feasted on every gruesome detail, turning Angelica's story into a spectacle. They spoke of her in contrasting terms, some as a murderer, others as a victim driven to the brink. Talk shows debated the morality of her actions. Experts dissected her mental state, questioning what had finally pushed her over the edge. Her face, once that of a respected nurse, a devoted mother, was now plastered across television screens and newspaper covers. The trial began 6 months later. The courtroom was packed from the first day. Reporters lined the aisles, their cameras flashing, their pens scratching furiously across notepads. Strangers filled the gallery, eager to witness the unfolding drama, whispering among themselves as they stole glances at the woman who had shocked an entire city. Angelica sat at the defendant's table, unmoving. She listened as the prosecution laid out their case, their voices sharp, methodical, dissecting every moment of that night with clinical detachment. They painted her as a woman consumed by jealousy, driven by a thirst for revenge so deep that she had crossed the line into cold-blooded murder. They spoke of the premeditation, the sleeping pills, the calculated message to lure Lauren into the house, the methodical way she had staged the evening, ensuring everything was set in place before she acted. A crime of passion, they admitted, but one carried out with chilling precision. Her defense attorney countered with a different narrative. She was not a monster, he argued. She was a woman pushed beyond the limits of her endurance, a victim of an unbearable betrayal. He spoke of the deception, the years of trust shattered in a single instant. He described the emotional torment, the suffocating weight of knowing that the two people she loved most had conspired against her in the cruelest of ways. Temporary insanity, he argued. A mind broken by grief. Angelica remained silent. She did not react as former colleagues took the stand, describing her as kind, compassionate, devoted to her work. She did not flinch when former friends testified that she had begun to withdraw in the weeks leading up to the night of the crime, that she had seemed distant, troubled. She did not look at Julian as he entered the courtroom, his presence eliciting a wave of hushed murmurs. He walked with effort, his injuries still fresh, his movements stiff. His expression remained unreadable as he took his place, as he spoke of the woman he had once called his wife. He did not beg for leniency. He did not condemn her either. When asked if he had loved her, he hesitated. When asked if he had betrayed her, he did not deny it. The jury deliberated for days. The city held its breath, waiting for the final word, for the resolution to the story that had gripped them for months. The verdict was delivered in a hushed courtroom. Guilty. The sentence, 25 years. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Some believed it was too harsh. Others, too lenient. The judge spoke at length about the tragedy of the case, about the complexities of justice in the face of such overwhelming emotion. Angelica did not react. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply rose when instructed, allowing the bailiff to escort her out of the courtroom, away from the flashing cameras, away from the murmuring crowd. She had already lost everything. There was nothing left to take. 10 years had passed. Time moved differently within the thick concrete walls of the prison, where the outside world felt like a distant dream, something that existed beyond the steel bars and razor wire fences. The days inside stretched endlessly, identical in their monotony, bleeding into one another until Angelica stopped trying to distinguish them. Mornings began with the sharp clang of metal doors unlocking in unison, followed by the shuffle of feet as inmates filed into line for breakfast. The food was the same every day, bland, lukewarm, barely enough to remind her of taste. The guards called names, assigned tasks, enforced routines with mechanical efficiency. The same cold tile floors, the same dim overhead lights, the same scent of antiseptic and sweat. Nothing changed, nothing ever moved forward. She had once tried counting the days, marking each one with small scratches on the inside of her bunk frame. But somewhere around year 3, she had stopped. There was no point. She had learned quickly how to survive in this place. Keep your head down. Don't speak unless necessary. Stay out of the way. The first few months had been the hardest, adjusting to the unspoken rules, the quiet power struggles among the inmates, the endless waiting. But eventually, even the worst of it had dulled, becoming part of the rhythm of her existence. The other women left her alone for the most part. Some had whispered about her at first, the woman who had killed her own sister, the wife who had nearly ended her husband's life. The ones who found it scandalous eventually lost interest. The ones who understood, the ones who had their own betrayals, their own darkness, they said nothing. She didn't seek companionship, and she didn't offer any. She went through the motions, followed the routine, existed in a space where nothing reached her. But once a month, the past forced its way through the prison gates. Her children visited her on the first Saturday of every month. They had grown. Marcus was now 20, taller than she had ever imagined, his features sharper, more defined, though his eyes still held traces of the boy she had kissed goodnight all those years ago. Camille was 17, no longer the child she had left behind, her voice steady, her posture poised with the careful confidence of someone who had learned how to navigate life without her mother. They sat across from her in the visitation room, the cheap plastic table between them an unspoken barrier. They were never unkind. They never raised their voices, never looked at her with hatred or disgust. But there was something else in their eyes, something deeper, heavier. Pain. It was not the rage of betrayal or the sharp sting of resentment. It was something quieter, something far worse. It was loss. They had lived 10 years without her. Grown into themselves without the warmth of a mother's presence. They had birthdays without her, learned to drive without her, celebrated graduations with an empty chair where she should have been. They had been forced to carry her absence like a weight neither of them had asked for. And she saw it in the way they spoke to her now, and the careful way they chose their words, and the way Marcus's hands always remained folded on the table, as if he was holding himself back from reaching for her, afraid of the emotions that might rise to the surface. Camille had once asked her why she did it. Not angrily. Not accusingly. Just softly, with the quiet sadness of someone searching for something that would never make sense. Angelica had not answered. Because there was no answer. She had justified it to herself in those first few years. Told herself that it had been justice, that Julian and Lauren had deserved everything they had received. That she had taken from them as they had taken from her. But no revenge could ever undo what had been lost. Julian had survived, but he had never visited. She didn't expect him to. She knew that he had left Charlotte shortly after the trial, moving to another state, trying to rebuild whatever remained of his life. He had never remarried. Never sought another family. Lauren was gone. And with her, the last piece of what had once been Angelica's life. There had been times in the first few years of her sentence when she had tried to remember them as they had once been. Before the betrayal. Before the night that had rewritten everything. She had tried to recall Julian's laughter, the way he used to hold her in the mornings before they started their day. She had tried to remember the warmth of Lauren's presence, the way her younger sister had once looked up to her, trusted her, loved her. But those memories had faded, consumed by the weight of what had come after. She no longer dreamed of freedom. She knew that one day, the gates would open for her. That time would eventually move forward, that the world outside would continue shifting, changing, making space for her absence. But who would she be then? She did not know. The woman she had once been had died 10 years ago, long before the trial, long before the prison walls had closed around her. She had died the moment she had read that first message on Julian's phone, the moment she had realized that the life she had built was nothing more than a fragile illusion. The Angelica who had believed in love, in family, in trust, she was gone. And what remained was something else entirely. She would walk out of these walls one day. She would step back into a world that no longer knew her, no longer expected anything from her. But she would never again allow herself to believe in love. Love had been the lie that had destroyed her. and she would never let it happen again.